So if you want to know about prairies, Michelle is the person to talk to. And we're very fortunate to have her, and we really appreciate her being here. So I'm just going to read a little blurb here about her, which I had 5 seconds ago. Here it is. Michelle Villafranca was at the Fort Worth Nature Center for years, but she was recently promoted into Park Operations Planner position in Park Operations for the City of Fort Worth, where she reviews plans, makes policy recommendations, and advises on natural resource management planning. Prior to this, she served 11 years as natural resource specialist for the Fort Worth Nature Center and Refuge. In that role, she was responsible for the restoration greenhouse and seed collection program, which incorporated volunteers to produce native plant material for restoration, landscaping, and public programming. She coordinated with the Native Neighborhoods Association, which provided native plants to Fort Worth residents. Michelle also kickstarted the Refuge's fire effects monitoring program by establishing biological surveys and photo points to determine baseline data to monitor habitat restoration activities, especially prescribed burning. Michelle started with the City of Fort Worth in 2004 as a forester, where she organized tree planting events and coordinated volunteer projects. Before the city, she worked for various conservation and land management agencies in Texas and beyond. And I met Michelle at the Fort Worth Nature Center. She used to do every other weekend coordinating the Natural Guard, and so I've known her for a lot of years. I used to really, I would still like to do it if I didn't live so far, but I really, that's a great volunteer opportunity for any of you guys that are looking for something that's very eclectic, because you get a lot of different experiences. You really learn a lot, and I did really learn a lot from Michelle, and she was always a lot of fun to work for and with. So again, thank you, Michelle, and we're so glad to have you, and you can take it away.
All right, well, thank you. I guess first I want to apologize beforehand, because this is a presentation that I give in person and I didn't have time to like make it Zoomy, because I would have loved to put surveys in or polls and different interactive things, but I didn't have time. In fact, I had to cut slides out of my presentation. So we'll see. I'll try to not keep you all night. Okay, let's see if I can advance. Okay. So, I kind of run through when I create presentations, I really am just answering questions that I have. And so I set the presentation up with all these questions in mind, which helps me develop a presentation. So my first question is, well, if you've never really learned or thought about a prairie, what is a prairie? So you can see on the maps, it's a grassland biome. It's the most altered on the earth. And you can see the orange. I wish I could point like I would if I were in person. The orange areas are where there are grasslands and savannas. And then in the US, we have this whole area that's, considered the Great Plains generally of the US. There's less than 1% of that habitat still left from pre-settlement times. This is actually split up. It's probably hard to see on the map, but the more eastern or pink portion is the tall grass. And then as you go west, it grades into mixed grasslands and then short grass prairies. So we're essentially kind of on the edge of tall grass and mixed grass prairie. Really, Blackland Prairie is more of your tall grass, and then kind of the Fort Worth area heading west until you get more into the rolling plains would be the mixed grass prairie. Oops, oh, I don't want to hit that, sorry. Okay, so this is just a photographic example of some of these different So the one with the purple coneflower is from Consa Prairie in Kansas, and then that's the example of tall grass prairie. Then the mixed grass prairie is actually just north of Decatur, kind of looking down southeast towards Fort Worth. And the other picture is out by Alabate Flint Quarries in the Panhandle. And then the bottom with the trees is savanna, and that, I think I took that at the Nature Center off of Broadview, I believe. So there are a lot of really good books out there, and that'll be at the end. I'll have some recommendations of reading material. But John Madsen wrote a book about prairies, and it's a really emotional and science-based book. And I just pulled this quote from it because I thought it was so good, that the wealth of the tallgrass prairie was its undoing. So that really just means that it's so rich in diversity, which produces really good soil that is good for farming generally. You know, the mixed and the tallgrass prairie definitely are good for farming, and then parts of shortgrass prairie. So what are some factors that define prairies? And by the way, y'all can pipe in anytime you want through the chat. And if I see chat questions, I'll try to address them throughout, because it's a lot more fun to have interaction from people. Okay, so factors that define prairies. Well, you have geology. Geology is a huge factor that maybe not everyone, thinks about. This photo was taken near the Nature Center, and it's just showing your top grassland species up on top, like little bluestem, but then it's showing different layers of geology, and they're all from marine deposition during the Cretaceous period. And so I just have some kind of, you know, the flow of geology. You have marine deposition, then you have erosion from the Rockies that wash down. That's really west of here. And then you have deposition from rivers and from the marine environment. And then you have contemporary erosion. And this other map is just of the Cretaceous. Y'all have probably heard that there was a shallow inland sea running through the central part of the US that covered Texas at the time. I have here ancient events set the stage for what we see today. So this is a picture that I actually took at the Nature Center in an area where the city was digging out, and it actually is showing like the layer of fine beach sand, which more than likely was from a river. This is probably river deposition of the meandering of the West Fork of the Trinity River in ancient times. Like, I don't know if it was the Cretaceous or more recent geologic time, but more than likely from the meander of that ancient riverbed, and it would deposit fine sands in parts of the meander, and then say at another time it's depositing gravel bars. It could also be, and I don't know this because I'm not a geologist, it could have been kind of a marshy area where you had at times it was inundated with more water where fine sands deposited out versus another time you had gravels. But basically you're getting gravel, sands, silts, clays, and as your major deposition, sedimentary deposition here. But then also when you get that hard limestone that you see at the Nature Center and some other places, that's the marine calcium carbonate secretions from the animals that used to live in these ancient shallow seas. So another thing that defines prairies is the soil. So you have geology, then you have the soil. Soil determines what vegetation grows upon it. This map is really hard to read. I don't know if you can really see it, but if you travel much through Texas, you can really recognize the vegetation differences as you drive from east to west across Texas. So like the sandy post oak savanna, the Blackland Prairie is clay and some limestone. Then there's the eastern cross timbers, which is sandy, and then the Grand Prairie, and then western cross timbers. And so can y'all see my arrow? Okay, so right here, Grand Prairie, that's what I call Fort Worth Prairie, and I'll probably explain that later on in the presentation in more detail. And then you have your soil chart, and it's kind of cool to how you use it, although I've never had occasion really to use it. But it is pretty handy to show you how loam pretty much sets, like that's kind of like the perfect condition of sand, silt, clay all together. Well, so what else is in the soil? It's not just dirt. In fact, you shouldn't even call it dirt because soil is alive. And there are all these different creatures that could potentially be in the soil. And I was reading in Candace Savage's book. She has prairies. A single, oh, I'm hearing reverb. So probably everyone needs to mute. Okay, so a single teaspoon of soil can hold about 5 billion microbes, which are single-celled organisms, algae, fungi, bacteria, and protozoans. So if you ever just take a teaspoon of soil, you can imagine that there are a lot of living things in that we just can't even see unless you use a microscope or even something that breaks it down even more. So another thing that defines prairies is the wind. The wind is moving the soil, it's desiccating the plants. That's key. Key characteristics of prairies. They're very harsh environments outside of like fall and spring. Winters can be really cold and a lot of wind. There's nothing really breaking up the wind, right, in a prairie. And the top picture is actually from, I didn't take this one, but it's from the sandhills of Nebraska. And so that's glacier deposit. So sand that was in soils that were pushed and ground down from the advance and retreat of glaciers coming down from like Canada and the northern US across that prairie. And that might be a reason that trees didn't get established, you know, to begin with, is that they probably never had a chance with glaciers during that time. And that would have been during the Ice Age. And this is just a photo that one of my friends is an artist, and I just love it so much because to me, it's really showing like the Dust Bowl and the prairie and like the fierceness of the wind, but the destruction that we did as humans to the prairie environment through farming. Not that we, you know, back then, people didn't know as much about farming techniques at that time. You had tractors coming online and people have to eat, but it's just kind of, to me, represents the environmental damage of the Dust Bowl. Something else that defines prairies is precipitation. And so precipitation and drought are following this gradient. They kind of, fire follows that gradient as well from the east to the west. So in the eastern US, fire is not like a major regime unless you're getting down into maybe the southeast and Florida and marshes. But if you think of just like the northeast forests or kind of northern forests, you don't really hear of fires playing a major role. But as you move further west across the US, then fire, it starts grading into savannas and prairies and desert, and you know, all the way into California, where the California and the northwest coast or northwestern states that are very fire oriented ecosystems. This map right here shows the precipitation gradient. Generally, like the average rainfall from Beaumont is like 56 inches of rain every year on average, all the way over to Fort Stockton, where you see a little circle, it looks like a donut, in the Big Bend region of Texas. And that actually is like, goes down to 14 and then down to 10 inches of rain. Someone is actually driving up to my house. Sorry. This is one of the distractions of like doing this from home, is like, who's driving up my driveway? It might be the UPS person. Okay, so you're just saying also that patterns of moisture and temperature, which are the climate, that they're also dictated by latitude. So if you think of like at the equator, they're getting a lot more rain at the equator than as you move further north. So once you get up into parts of Canada, I guess they could be getting snow, but they may not necessarily be getting the same amount of rainfalls in a year. Let's see. And drought. Drought is a definite defining factor of prairies, and that's what prairies do. Drought happens in prairies, and it's no big deal. And the reason it's really no big deal is because prairies are based on grass, and grass is very resilient, and these prairie systems are dominated by bunch grasses, which have really extensive root systems. And they can go dormant in the winter, and they can get by with very little rain. So that's why you see over time, if you're moving from east to west, you have a lot of tall trees. And then as you're coming through Texas, they're getting shorter and shorter and shorter. As you're heading through the DFW area, you get to the rolling plains, and they're a lot shorter, right? Because the moisture regime doesn't maintain trees as well. Trees have a harder go of it. So I was just including this drought index from 2011 because we probably all remember in 2011 we're in a really extreme drought, and the temperature was getting up to like 100 million degrees every day, and we had fires. Well, anyways, and then we only had like 15 inches of rain, and then let's see, then in 2018 you see how it's very variable. Well, then if you think to 2015, I should have included this in the rainfall amount. Is at my house in 2015 in May, it rained like 16 inches and whatever, like practically overnight. So you have really extreme conditions. Yeah, so DFW's annual rainfall was 62 inches in 2015. And another factor that defines prairies are wildfires. So this is, or fires, not wildfires. This is not a wildfire, but it was a prescribed burn that we did at the Nature Center in the demo prairie. So if you're driving up to the Hardwick, you see there's like a sliver on one side of the road, which would be on your left. If you're driving to the visitor center, this is where that picture was taken. But wildfires are fueled from drought stressed or cured dormant vegetation. So, I mean, green vegetation can burn, we all know that, but typically in some areas, in the winter, when it's dry, fires could get started by humans, and then they could be really accelerated because everything's dry and cured, or in a drought when everything's under stress. Green vegetation doesn't burn as readily, so a lot of times if you were to burn in the summer, you have to really monitor what the conditions are to get the optimal burn. And the other thing that defines prairies are grasses. So I think a lot of people, even me included, I don't always, when I think of a prairie, I'm always thinking of the beautiful wildflowers, but really, what makes a prairie are the grasses. If you didn't have the grasses, if you just always only had the wildflowers, then it wouldn't be a true prairie. And the prairies are just like forests. So I guess y'all have had your forest ecosystem presentation, and you probably talked about how forests have vertical structure. So they have the litter layer, duff, you have the understory, you have shrub species and your perennial ground cover species, and you have mid canopy, and then you have the upper canopy. And people don't really think of this with prairies, but they also have this. It's just not really, no one ever talks about it, but grasses and those flowers are providing basically your upper canopy of a grass forest, which is known as a prairie. And you wouldn't have a prairie also if you didn't have pollinators. Of course, we wouldn't have the world as we know it if we didn't have pollinators. But if you think of, if you go through a forest, obviously forests are getting pollinated. That versus a prairie, if you just look at the pollinators that are evident on a walk in the prairie versus the forest, it'll blow your mind once you really start paying attention. But some of the really obvious pollinators in a prairie are bees, right? So honeybees, European honeybees are not native, but we use them to pollinate our crops. But we have loads and loads and loads of native species that pollinate all of our native plants, as well as pollinating crops, I guess by accident. And we have, this is a list of kind of a quick guide of how to identify at least 9 bumblebee species that are native to Texas. And then we have 18 native bees that are listed by the state of Texas as species of greatest conservation need. And what that means is their habitat's disappearing. We don't know that much about them. We don't really know their habitat requirements, but we know they exist. And bumblebeewatch.org, I think that website doesn't, I don't know if it's active anymore. And then obviously iNaturalist is a great resource for learning and identifying pollinators. So 95% of all the species on Earth are invertebrates. And so that invertebrates includes insects. And so these are just pictures that I've taken in my yard. I landscape with native plants. And these are pictures that I've taken in my yard of plants and then the pollinators that pollinate those plants. And so every day, like right now, my yard had like a 1-month lull in flowering. It started flowering in February with different species. Then it took a break while it got really hot. And then since the temperature's cooled a little bit and we've gotten a little bit of rain, now my fall blooming flowers are starting to flower. So my yard is starting to pop with like purples and some blues and lots of yellow and white. So my yard's getting really, yeah, I love my yard. So if all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed 10,000 years ago. So that's if humans disappear, right? But if insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. And that's a quote by E.O. Wilson, who's a famous biologist. And he specializes in insects, and he's also known for ant research. So let's see. So what are some other factors that define prairies? Grazing. So our original grazers of the prairies were bison. They're the keystone species of the prairie. And what they do is their grazing stimulates grass. So when they're eating grass, a lot of prairie species grasses are actually stimulated by grazing. And so you could also say, like when we mow, especially under good conditions, we're getting good moisture and temperatures, you mow, well, what does that do? It just causes the grass to grow faster if it's getting enough moisture. And also things like hay or blue stem will just seed like 10 minutes after you mow. Grazing also aerates the soil. So the bison hooves are, they're walking around, they're tearing up the soil a little bit. That's aerating the soil. That's providing seed bed for the seeds of the prairie plants as they drop into the bison hoof prints. And bisons also wallow. So they're creating ephemeral temporary wetlands and watering holes for wildlife. And those wetlands actually have usually along the perimeter, and as the wetland dries up, it'll have different species of plants in those wetlands. And obviously bison are adding nutrients to the soil and they're changing the fire regime. So right now, bison are not doing that because we don't have landscape scale bison herds on landscape scale prairies, but they did change the fire regime, and they would if you had a large enough area for them to graze, because they're gonna graze down some areas, not graze down others. They may push down some small woody plants, and that's changing your fuel load, which will change the frequency and the intensity of fire and the rate of spread of fire. Another keystone species are prairie dogs and black-footed ferrets. So we don't have black-footed ferrets here, but you can see on the map that at one point there was the historic range included, not really right up to here, but close. 100 million acres of prairie, which is kind of mixed grass into short grass prairie. And that was the historic range of the black-footed ferret. So the black-footed ferret, y'all probably know, is focused only on eating prairie dogs. So whenever you have a colony of prairie dogs or a prairie dog town, black-footed ferrets should be with them in that colony, using their dens and eating prairie dogs. But what happened to the prairie dogs? Generally, there are still prairie dogs, obviously, but they really got over harvested, and not even harvested because someone wanted to eat the prairie dog or use its fur. As people moved further west and they started farming and ranching, they hated prairie dogs because prairie dogs make dens and holes and colonies in cattle habitat or where you're farming. So, and I just pulled this, I forget where I grabbed that quote from, but researchers in 1924, they just said prairie dog does not possess a single beneficial food habit, nor is there any argument against its complete eradication on all grazing ranges. So with attitudes like that, obviously, you know, they're a rodent, so people want to kill them, and they were reduced by a lot. Well, if you're killing off most of your prairie dogs, then obviously black-footed ferrets, which are focusing on prairie dog as their only food source, are going to diminish as well. Up in, I forget if it's Montana or Wyoming, they thought that black-footed ferrets were completely extinct, and then some ranchers found some on their property, and it turned out they found, I forget, like maybe 24, I can't remember, but they found like a small number of black-footed ferrets that somehow are like the last surviving creatures, or last surviving black-footed ferrets. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually took some of them and mated them, and actually were able to bring the black-footed ferrets global population back up. So some other grazers that define prairies are the ones that we don't think of. So we obviously think of bison, that's what everyone thinks of as a prairie grazer in addition to cattle. But I'm talking about native species right now. So other grazers are grasshoppers, and there are so many species of grasshoppers. I don't even know how many, but I know there was a grasshopper, she was a researcher, and she came to the Nature Center in Tandy Hills and did some surveys, and she found at least, I think she found like 13 to 15 different species of grasshoppers, and that was just her going out for like an hour or two sweet netting. So that shows you the diversity of grasshoppers, and these grasshoppers could be focusing on different things for their food source, like certain species of grass, or maybe some of them aren't even eating grass. They could be eating some forbs. Water bears, I like to call them grazers because they're under the soil and they're grazing on plant roots. So they're sipping out the fluids out of plant roots, but that's kind of a form of grazing under the soil. And again, Candace Savage, in her book, she says 1 square yard of prairie's topsoil can support 5,000 to 15,000 springtails, and they're feeding on dying roots and microbes in the soil, as well as dead invertebrates. So talk about seed ticks and chiggers and no-see-ums. Water bears and springtails are kind of no-see-ums that are living in the soil as some of the dominant creatures that are living in the soil. And also leaf hoppers. So I did not realize this until not too long ago, maybe a couple of years ago, that there's an amazing diversity of leaf hoppers. And there are people who study leaf hoppers. So there's a student, and actually she was the girlfriend of our intern a couple of years ago. And she was studying leaf hoppers, a certain species of leaf hoppers that feeds only on little blue stem grass. So there are some, I think, that feed on Johnson grass. They can be very specific in their dietary needs. So I think that's something that, you know, who even thinks about leafhoppers? If you happen to notice one and see one, you might think it's cool, but did you know that there's a huge diversity of them? And then our other grazers of the prairie are cattle. So I think I had a slide under there, but we'll not worry about it. This picture of cattle is actually from some people in, they're up by Sulphur, let's see, not Sulphur Springs, but kind of in that area of Northeast Texas, and they own a 1,000-acre ranch, and they have most of their property under a conservation easement with the Native Prairies Association of Texas. And they've restored without really seeding their property. They just released the grazing pressure of that property, and all kinds of really amazing prairie grasses and wildflowers came up after they took ownership of that land. It's just a family. They're doing the 1,000 acres all themselves. And they're running a sustainable cattle ranching business. And this is cattle, like really chunky cattle that are eating really well, standing in the middle of this prairie on their property. So now we're going to talk about adaptations, because a prairie is a prairie because also it has certain adaptations to make it a prairie and not a forest. One of the adaptations is photosynthesis. So there are two different kinds of photosynthesis. There's C3, and I'm not an expert on this. I know just enough to be dangerous, but C3 photosynthesis is for cool season grasses, and these are plants that evolved way before the warm season grasses. So they evolved back when our climate was a lot cooler. They would have done really well during the Ice Age, and they're not efficient at processing their metabolism, or not their metabolism, metabolic processing. Most of their water is lost through transpiration. It's because they're not really, C3 photosynthesis doesn't really close up the stomates. They're just kind of open all the time. So that's why they really evolved as cool season plants. Whereas C4 photosynthesis are your warm season plants, warm season grasses, such as little bluestem, Indian grass, the things that are like going full on and seeding in the heat of the summer. And that process is more efficient, so it's like evolved a little bit more than the C3 photosynthesis, where the stomata can open and close and have better exchange and control over losing water. So another adaptation is fire, which we talked about briefly. But for our prairies, as I mentioned, life processes are underground. So the grasses are really putting everything into the roots. Trees do that as well. But if a tree is burned, the tree is always growing from its tip, right? It's growing from its ends and its tips. And grass is always growing from the ground. So if you have a fire sweep through, it'll burn off the grass. It might burn the trunk of a tree. The grass is back, right? Like that. It's typically back, you know, within a couple of days, it's already coming back up because everything's in the roots. But trees have so much invested in the top that a lot of times when we're trying to manage an area with fire, like say we're trying to manage woody species, trees are going to be hindered. It's really putting a crimp in their style if they get burned. And so a lot of, say, burning at the Nature Center and other places in this area, the reason for doing prescribed burns almost always is remove the thatch, you know, which is fine, but trying to control woody species. So fire, like it says down here, will remove thatch, just stimulating germination and growth. There are some species that will germinate because of fire. So if you think of the Sequoia National Park and the sequoias there, that's a fire adapted forest, and sequoias actually need fire to germinate the cones, as well as the longleaf pine forests of East Texas. That is also a fire dependent ecosystem that needs fire in order for it to the trees to germinate, or the seeds to germinate. And fire is returning nutrients to the soil. So prairies are a root-driven ecosystem, and if you destroy the roots, meaning you're digging down into the soil, you're destroying that place. So you could probably get away with it a couple of times, but if you think of during the Dust Bowl, it was like continuous tilling. You're destroying the biota of the soil, all that life force that's within the soil, and you're destroying the roots over time of the prairie. The rhizosphere, that's the soil root interface. That's where most of your biological activity is taking place, and that's what's binding the soil in place. Let's see, next one. So this is just highlighting because you can't really read the graphic. Something really short that could be like Bermuda grass or turf grass has really no roots, but then as you move across this graphic, and if you can actually see what the plants are, it's just kind of showing a comparison of the roots. So if you imagine roots that are dense like that, they're going down really deep into the soil, that's holding the soil in place. If you have something that only has roots that are 6 inches, that's not going to hold the soil in place very well. And so Packard is a person who wrote a book called the Tallgrass Prairie Restoration, or Tallgrass Prairie and Savanna Restoration Handbook. And he said that 65% of the biomass of a tallgrass prairie is underground. And so I actually, in the greenhouse, we were growing Engelmann's daisy, and what I pulled up one of the roots, and this wasn't the one in the pot. I think I had dug it somewhere. And the root, I mean, it looked like a carrot. So Engelmann daisy is a perennial, and it is just really hardy. And this is the reason why, because it has a lot of energy stored in the root. So you can see different mechanisms for grasses, the rhizome, the stolon, and seed heads. So that's several different ways that grasses can persist with prairie fires hitting them, wind, blizzards, drought. They have these different adaptations. And the roots are protected. Okay, where's my little arrow? So this is a picture. I didn't take it. I don't know who the guy is, but he apparently was able to dig all these different prairie grasses and illustrate what kind of root mass they have. So the roots, and this is true also, you have fungal associations with trees and forests. You also have that with grasses. So it's these symbiotic relationships with the roots of grasses. So one of them is rhizobial root nodules, which are found on legumes. And that's the bacteria that actually does the fixation of the nitrogen in the soil, because nitrogen is not something that's readily available to all plants, but legumes actually are able to pull nitrogen and fix it. And nitrogen also comes, you know, in the form when it rains, and there's some in the air. So they're able to pull that out and convert it to something that's usable. Also, you have mycorrhizae fungi, and that's just fungi that are on roots, and it's extending the capacity of the host root. So if you think of the surface area of just the root alone, then once you have fungi on it, it's these tiny little hair-like structures of the fungi that are actually extending surface area and the ability to catch more water and nutrients. Let's see. So I was just gonna see if anyone had any, it looks like there's some chat in here. Okay, you can see the cursor. I'm just gonna read through these real quick. Chiggers, we're talking about that. Yes. A wheel bug, I think, is in the assassin bug group. Is my yard a Texas smartscape? It is. My whole yard is all about the natives. I do have Bermuda grass, but I didn't plant it. It's just there, and then I don't water. I don't water. But my yard I think I have some pictures at the end, some pictures that I've taken in my yard, so maybe you'll see. So some other prairie adaptations are soil crust.
Eggs.
Okay.
So I think somebody needs to mute. Do you like a great mute? So nostoc is a cyanobacteria and moss. So that creates the nostoc creates the soil crust, and there are several other soil crusts which I'm not an expert on, but basically what that does is holds the soil in place, and it's keeping moisture in, it's transporting nutrients, and just protecting the soil from erosion. I keep losing my there it is, my arrow. So this one is called angel snot, and it looks like snot. And what it is gelatinous. And so it'll, whenever there's moisture or it rains, then it hydrates and gets slimy, but then it'll dry whenever everything dries out, then it turns into like a crust. So flowers also are part of the adaptation. So I just like to compare flowers that you might find in the woods and the diversity and amount of flowers that you would find in woods versus what you find in a prairie. And it's pretty vast. You have a lot more variety of color, pollinators, life forms that are growing in a prairie versus a woodland. So some of the things that flowers have an adaptation, I'm just going to list them here. So shape is an adaptation. So for example, on the primrose, the yellow flower, it has really flat petals that kind of splay out, and that's really good for attracting beetles, which kind of rest on the petal of the flower. And the large opening to access the nectar is good for the moths and some butterflies that pollinate that genre. Color, different colors attract different pollinators. There are patterns. If a flower petal has certain lines that act to attract pollinators, and then the bloom time, that really coincides with when pollinators are emerging and what time they're emerging, and that's all about evolution. And then scent. Some flowers have scent, some don't, but some creatures can smell the scent. Another adaptation are seeds. So you have hard seeds like bluebonnet seeds that need to be scarified either through weathering or through running through the, like a bird eating it or running through the system of a mammal. Let's see. Also, these cockleburs have these hooks on them, so they catch on animal fur. Things that are in the milk, or this is the fluttermill seed, and milkweeds have some adaptations. So some of the seeds are fire dependent, surface coat, as I mentioned, delayed germination or dormancy. So some, if all the seeds of a certain flower matured at the same time and fell to the ground, they're not all going to germinate, because a lot of plants have delayed germination, because you wouldn't want, nature wouldn't want that everything drops to the ground, it rains, it germinates, and then you have a drought thereafter, then that would wipe out your entire crop. And some are wind pollinated, so milkweeds are wind pollinated, and surface texture, like I said, on the cocklebur, and animal dispersed, so either through animals eating it and pooping the seed out, or it being caught in the animal fur. Leaves are an adaptation as well. So these are just different types of leaves. So this hairy leaf on a Maximilian sunflower Lots of hair actually helps hold moisture in, helps control the release and transpiration of water from the plant. Prickly pear pads, they have a lot of kind of gelatinous moisture within the pads, and then their spines are actually modified. And then like just buffalo grass has adaptations for being short, and sometimes the male and the female seeds, I think that, I can't remember, I think well, I'm not even gonna say one of the seeds, I think it's the female seed that's buried down in the plant is not viable. So prairies are the front lines in the battle of water conservation, and some of their tools of the trade would be they're waxy, like a prickly pear pad, hairy, they're long, they fold like Maximilian sunflower, they're succulent, leathery, spines. And then also animals have adaptations. So I don't really go over animals too much because I think y'all have like a mammal and a bird presentation in your Master Naturalist class. So, but I just wanted to kind of go over quickly. Migration, bison, cowbirds followed the bison. So cattle egrets actually immigrated here naturally, but they all kind of follow the food of following the bison. The vision, either monocular forward or binocular, where you see out. And so binocular vision is for prey animals, because they need to be able to kind of see all around. And then monocular vision are for the predators, so they need to really focus straight ahead to catch that prey. Regulation through reduced or enlarged body parts, such as the jackrabbit having really large ears, which is helping to regulate their temperature and help them survive in a really harsh, hot environment. And then activity at twilight, so morning and evening, or in the middle of the night, those are all adaptations for surviving in a prairie. And then some of them just live underground. And so this mole is one that I found in my yard, but my dogs found it first and killed it. So I had a really good specimen of a mole. Then some other animals will hibernate or estivate. So we don't really have hibernation here in this part of the world, but maybe up in Nebraska and further north, there are species that actually just hunker down for the winter. And then estivate is just based on short duration, kind of laying low, but it's not true hibernation. And then also creatures have coloration and camouflage that helps them adapt to the environment. And then hooves, teeth, and stomach. So that's a pretty recent adaptation. So cattle are like our now more recent contemporary prairie megafauna. So all of this, whenever I put my presentation together, I think, was thinking about, well, what was it like even before our human documentation of prairies in the, say, dating back to 1700s or so. So I took a deep dive back through geology. And so this part of the world at some point would have had fern prairies. I don't know if like really necessarily right here, but way, way, way back when there were dinosaurs, there were things known as fern prairies, because this would have been before grasses evolved and before prairies evolved. Then during the Cretaceous period, during that period, you would have started to have the evolution of grass. So this is just a picture of like a dinosaur that's actually with grass. I don't know how, that's just an imagination, but grasses, we do know that grasses evolved during that period. Well, actually it was after the Cretaceous period. And so then we would have had the kind of end of the dinosaurs from the KT event, which is, that's just the transition between Cretaceous, from the Cretaceous to contemporary times. And it was, is scientifically essentially proven that it was a meteor probably that created a global effect. That line in that picture of the KT event is iridium, and I forget when it was, but in Italy, a father-son geologist team discovered this thin layer in the geology there and tested it, and it's iridium, which is not derived from Earth, but it is on meteors. It's not a mineral, but it's a component of meteors. And then with further study, they found, and other scientists found, that that iridium layer is global. So it's global. So that's showing that transition between those two. So grasses are actually more recent. So after that KT event, which pretty much wiped out the dinosaurs and pretty quickly, other animals evolved, but they were all much smaller. So they would have been, some of these animals would have been here, but they just through evolution, you know, evolved into something more than like what we know right now. Horses evolved during this time after the disappearance of the dinosaurs, and they evolved these high crown teeth. And high crown teeth are in animals that eat grass. And that's for, you know, because of kind of grinding up silica-laden vegetation. Grass has a lot of silica in it. So cows and horses have specialized stomachs and teeth to eat grass. And so grasses and those grass-eating animals evolved at the same time, around the same time. So then during the Cenozoic and during the Ice Age, you would have grazers that were evolving in prairie and savanna settings, such as the Columbian mammoth and the short-faced bear and the giant sloth. And y'all probably looked at this plant when you're on your forest field trip, which is a honey locust. And honey locusts are doubly armored trees, and there's no reason that a honey locust should have spines upon spines for any of the animals that exist right now that would eat that. So deer, you don't need to be that armored to prevent browsing from deer. So it's postulated, or maybe it's proven, that I think it's postulated that giant ground sloths and some of these animals that lived up until the Ice Age were actually eating, browsing on these trees. So like Osage orange with the horse apples, and then honey locusts. So I just threw this in here because if you're interested in kind of the deep dive geologically, you can go down to the Mammoth, Waco Mammoth site, which is now run by the National Park Service, and you can see an actual archaeological dig, where some Columbian mammoths died. They were buried in situ in place from a massive flood event on the Bosque River. And it also, they also have a camel and saber-toothed tiger that were buried over time in these big flood events there. And then there are also bison kill sites. So all of that to say, in the more recent geologic past, you had paleo people who were living in this area that were grassland humans. They were living off of the grassland ecosystems and hunting bison and doing bison jumps. So I don't know, let's see, y'all. I guess Melinda, tell me when y'all need a break. I'll have a natural break here, I think, after this. So, so then that's kind of, we've gone through the geologic past. Then I'm really interested in, well, what was our more recent history here in this area that's related to prairies? And so if you think back to when the Spaniards came into the US, which wasn't the US at the time, but when they kind of pushed through Texas and New Mexico, there is some documentation of them being in this area, you know, all the way west. So they would have explored. They're the ones who brought horses, because they had our contemporary horses are not native to the US. They're not native to this continent. The actual horses that were North American native horse species actually died during, at the end of the Ice Age, I believe. So anything that is an equine right now came not from here. And so the Spaniards brought horses into Mexico and into what was to become the US. And so you also have, some of you may know history of the Comanches and how they were a Native American tribe that was in this part of Texas all the way, and they would all the way through West Texas and then up north. And they were kind of the underdogs of Native Americans until they got a hold of some horses and became expert horsemen and women. And then that was like a tool along later with guns that helped them dominate the grasslands of Texas and the kind of central part of the US. Oh, go back. So bison ruled our prairie. We had pronghorn, elk, bear, and wolf. So all of those species were present in the DFW area. You know, and pronghorn and elk and bear actually were prairie species. We don't really think of elk as being that, or bear, but they would have been also on the grasslands. And so in 1871, there's an account of, I think this was not, I don't remember if this was exactly here in this area, but it's just showing the massiveness of bison migration, where this explorer or military person went through on a survey team, I guess, and he said at least 25 of the 34 miles were through just one herd of bison. And they could see 6 or 10 miles in most directions, and it was just all bison. So this right here is just showing the range of bison over time. And there are actually some wood bison, let's see, up here, but even all the way up into like Ohio and these kind of Great Lakes states that have prairie, bison would have been roaming through those areas as well. Then we had the railroads and the Industrial Revolution. So you had people kind of pushing west, but until railroads were, you know, became more prominent, and then they did land grants. You had the Industrial Revolution, which was facilitating the expansion of the railroads and guns, production of guns. Well, then railroads were kind of, everyone's trying to get people further west to build up a market. And with that also is the decline of the bison, because it was putting more people out with the ability to kill bison. Well, so Fort Worth was settled on grasslands right through the Chisholm Trail. So y'all probably know your Texas history. We basically kind of eliminated the bison for various reasons, but one of them was to control the Native Americans so that we could push further west. Well, then, you know, we wanted to ranch, we as the people who were settling in this area. And so they marched longhorns up from Mexico. They're a really hardy species that could handle that drive across land to get to, say, the Fort Worth stockyards and get up to Kansas. So most of the bison were killed out until Charles Goodnight, who was a rancher in West Texas, realized he wanted to help save them, but I think he also realized that he could create a market for it. So he helped save the bison. And of course, cattle are needy. They're not going to be able to withstand the same things that bison could withstand. So then there was a rush of settlement. You get people out through the railroads, then they're starting to plow up the prairies. You get the new technologies like the tractor that I had mentioned, and everything's fine and dandy for so many, excuse me, a couple of decades. But the constant plowing of the soil and not having cover crops and not terracing, etc., led to what is known as the worst environmental disaster in the US, which was the Dust Bowl. And then with that, then you get erosion. So it's taking thousands of years for these prairies and also woodlands, but thousands of years for that vegetation and geology to interact and create soil, but we can destroy that in half a day through plowing. And so that boils down to grasslands are soil builders. So I don't know if y'all want to take a quick break, a stretch, and then I can go into the different prairies, or do y'all want to keep going?
We could take a 10-minute break if this is a good spot for you, Michelle.
Yeah, I think so. And then I'll probably kind of towards the end, I'll just speed it up.
Okay, well, let's do 10 minutes. So 7:28, let's get started back. And
all right, so y'all probably had time to study this slide. It's just these are prairies of north central Texas, and it's different soil types that are defining the prairies. The vertisols are what you would find in the Blackland Prairie, and that has high shrink swell capacity for water. The alpha sols are in the eastern cross timbers, so that's really sandy soil, very drains very well. Mollisols are the Fort Worth Prairie, and combined, the Fort Worth Prairie and Blackland Prairie are kind of lumped together as the Grand Prairie, and that region also goes up into Arkansas, but we further break the mollisol soils down into what is known as the Fort Worth Prairie. And then the alpha sols, again, are the western cross timbers on the west. Okay, so we have these three different prairie types in this area. The Blackland Prairie, which runs up into Arkansas. The Fort Worth Prairie, that's known as the Grand Prairie. And that, I guess I'll talk about that in a minute. And then the cross timbers, eastern and western cross timbers. This map is from Dijksterhuis, from one of his papers. And it's just showing kind of a different version of that breakdown. So it depends on what resource or reference that you're looking at as to how they kind of split out these systems. The Blackland Prairie is one of the most critically endangered ecosystems in the world. And that's not just us saying it, that's the World Wildlife Fund is saying it, the Nature Conservancy. It's really endangered because it's farmed, because it has good farming soil, and also because it's DFW is right in the middle of the Blackland Prairie. So it got farmed and then it got urbanized. And less than 5,000 acres of that Blackland Prairie remains out of the original 12 million acres. And what that means by remains, that means unplowed. So less than 5,000 acres out of 12 million acres have not been plowed. And so you would find your original high quality prairie species. This photo I took at Clymer Meadow, which is east of Farmersville, so it's northeast of Dallas-Fort Worth. And it's land owned by the Nature Conservancy of Texas. So there are some things in Blackland Prairie that are within that Blackland Prairie ecosystem. There are amoeba mounds, and those are forming on not that Blackland Prairie clay soil, but on alpha soils, which are commonly associated with the Trinity River Terrace. And alpha soils meaning the sandy soils. And what they are these little mounds. You can't really see very well in that bottom picture, but the one with the flowers is like a raised mound that creates some micro topography. It creates micro habitats. I'm sorry, it's hard to see with the glare on my glasses. That micro topography of just a few feet actually creates micro habitats and just that little bit of elevation difference. So no one really knows what's created Mima mounds, and there are a lot of you know, ideas of how they have come to be. This picture of the mounds at the bottom is actually, I got that off the internet, and that's from the Palouse Prairie, which is in Idaho, and I think part of Washington State. I would love to go there. I've never been there, but that's, I guess, a view from a plane. So some people say, well, maybe the Mima mounds were created by giant prehistoric gophers. It could be drainage patterns, hydraulic groundwater pressure, wind erosion and deposition, seismic activity, ancient wave action, or aliens. So I'd like to think it's aliens. None of these to me really give a full reason of how these mounds could be here, but I mean, it's obviously, it's not giant prehistoric gophers. I mean, probably not, and it's probably not aliens. One thing that I read in a paper on Mima mounds was saying that probably the most likely thing they could come up with was, like, if you look at forests in East Texas and in the east or southeast, trees, you know, their root balls kind of are raised and soil gathers around the base of the tree, making something of a mound. So maybe there used to be trees there at some point, and like these ancient trees, and then they're gone, and what's left are mounds. The other thing that could possibly be, could be some kind of water moving through the soil, but I don't think science has nailed that down completely. And another thing that you can find in the Blackland Prairie ecoregion are gilgai. And so this is like the inverse of Mima mounds. So these are concave, so depressions that are creating microhabitats. And they were known as hog wallows because they look like hog wallows, or nooner soils. And so whenever they were farming long ago, they called them nooner soils because it's in clay soils, and the clay would be too wet to farm or to run machines over in the morning or before noon, and then afternoon it would be too dried up and cracked to run farm equipment over. So they just called them, like, you only have that little bit of time at noontime to really do your plowing. So it's got soils. This clay is called smectite clay, or that's a description of the clay. And what it does is it's doing expansion and reversing expansion and contraction back and forth with moisture. And that actually causes it to churn and rotate and move the soil, the clay, around, like at the top, and then it creates cracks, then it comes down and it folds into itself. And all of that's based on moisture levels. But they create a wetland, so it's like little ephemeral pools, right, that are kind of evenly spaced across the landscape, but they're not protected. However, just within that less than a foot, usually, difference in elevation is creating a whole other habitat that has completely different plants that are wetland plants. So they're wetland obligate plants. You will hear my dogs in the background going nuts, and it's because my husband just drove up and the dogs are gonna start screaming, so bear with me. So this is just a graphic of the shrink, swell, and churning of the clay within the gilgai, and then the picture is showing how water pools. And this is just a cross-section of gilgai. I pulled that off the internet. I'm not actually seeing a cross-section in person, but you can kind of see how the clay's coming up. Then it's drying out, it's churning. It's just constantly turning over the soil within the gilgai. But there are some plants that are growing in the Blackland Prairie that are growing nowhere else in the world. Eastern gamma grass is not one of those. That is just an indicator plant of tall grass prairie, and it used to be very, very widespread across most of Texas, not just, you know, in the Blackland Prairie. But since fencing and cattle really, really, really like Eastern gamma grass. It's very leafy, it's bulky, it's got a lot of protein in it. And I've read that, I don't know if you know, if we can know what cattle think when they're eating the grass, but they call it like the ice cream for cattle. And so it's been mostly grazed out in most places. Long spiked tridents is an endemic, I think it's endemic to Texas, but it's globally endangered. So there's a plant association with this long spiked tridents and Sylvius dropseed that are found only in the Blackland Prairie. Sorry. So Sylvius dropseed and mead sedge plant community, they have that global status rank of critically imperiled across the entire world. There's some other plants that you would find in the Blackland Prairie, the false aloe, the compass plant, the Silphium laciniatum, which there's a couple other species of Silphium compass plants, but this is the predominant one that you would find in the Blackland Prairie, is the one that has yellow flowers, and then rattlesnake master. And so this is actually from Texas Parks and Wildlife, artist's rendering of the species you would find in the Blackland Prairie and what it might have looked like back when the bison were around. And my question is, well, what will become of the Blackland Prairie? Well, we kind of already know what will become of it. Anything that's around DFW, especially if it's prairie that has no trees, then that doesn't, you know, we just bulldoze over it and develop on top of it, and there's no protection whatsoever for prairies. And anything that was a prairie or is a prairie currently, most prairies have been plowed under, and the way that our taxes are, you know, for federal income tax, there's a lot of write-offs. So if you own a lot of land in an urbanized area that's farmable, instead of paying taxes on it, you want to get ag breaks or ag exemptions. So you just plow it under and plant some sacrificial crop. And so I think that's what's happening mostly in the Blackland Prairie area that you see farmed anywhere near DFW, just because, you know, what does it really pay to be a farmer in this area? My guess is it doesn't. So they just kind of plow it under until the property values rise, and then they can sell it. So these are some places that you can see Blackland Prairie. Again, Clymer Meadow in Collin County is a high quality relic prairie. And the reason it is in such a state is because it was used for haying. So it was not plowed under. The Fort Worth Prairie is then, if you go Blackland, you're in the east, you're in Blackland Prairie, then you jump over Eastern Cross Timbers, then the next prairie system is the Fort Worth Prairie. And I've outlined it here in blue using Google Earth. You can really see where the prairie is and where the Western Cross Timbers and the Fort Worth Prairie meet versus the versus the Eastern Cross Timbers. So it's pretty clearly defined because there aren't trees on the uplands of the Fort Worth Prairie. This is an illustration from Dijksterhuis. He was a NRCS, or Soil Conservation Service, rangeland ecologist who did some really comprehensive studies of the Western Cross Timbers and Fort Worth Prairie. He looked at grazing, he looked at remnant prairies that were not grazed. He did botanical surveys and did comparisons. So really, if you're wanting, you know, to really know what truly one could find in Fort Worth Prairie or the Western Cross Timbers, he's kind of the authoritative documenter of that. The Fort Worth Prairie is 10 to 30 miles wide, and it runs between the eastern and western cross timbers, east to west, and 110 miles long between the Red River to the north and the Brazos River to the south. The reason that we call it Fort Worth Prairie is because in about 1904 or 1900 and 1904, a surveyor came through this area. He was with the military, I believe, the Army, and he basically called this the Fort Worth Prairie, and he called it that because Fort Worth was kind of in the middle of it. So I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so, there was a professor at TCU named Dr. Tony Burgess, and he really focused his students, all of their field work, their master's degrees, all of his students, he really focused them on studying the Fort Worth Prairie and the cross timbers. And so he kind of recoined Fort Worth Prairie. And why would we call it Grand Prairie? Because Grand Prairie, the city, is not in the Fort Worth Prairie. Fort Worth is in the Fort Worth Prairie. So we're kind of just tying all that together to give that identity to Fort Worth. There are also, you know, we talked about the geology and the soils of the Fort Worth Prairie. The mollisols is clay also, just like in the Blackland Prairie. Like the vertisols, but the vertisols of the Blackland Prairie have a lot more churning and turnover of that soil versus mollisol soil has a lot, I guess, a lot more organic content and more lime, I think. You have limestone outcrops in the Blackland Prairie. It's a younger geologic layer than what you find in the Fort Worth Prairie. It's definitely Cretaceous, meaning 120,000 to 60,000 years. I mean, million years, not thousands, when the area was covered by an shallow inland sea. Going back to the Blackland Prairie, over time, since that inland sea was retreating, the water was retreating away because of the uplift of the Rockies. It was retreating kind of southeast to what now is the Gulf of Mexico. So over by Dallas and in the Blackland Prairie, that geology is younger because it was covered in ocean more recently. So it has more recent depositions of limestone and a completely different type of limestone. In this picture, this is at the Fort Worth Nature Center on the Caprock Trail, and it's Walnut Shell Formation, and that's it was an oyster reef, and it was they call it oyster hash, so that in these shallow seas, when there were violent storms, it would churn up the oyster beds and then just dump them back down and silt them in and deposit them and create this layer over time. So that was shallow environment, and then right here is the Goodland Formation, and that's deep water, much deeper, like I think up to 200 meters deep, which would have been the same time, but that deposition doesn't have a bunch of these oyster shells and stuff. It's more solid and globular, and that was deposited in deep ocean environment or deeper ocean environment. So this is something that Tony Burgess created for his students, and he shared it with myself and with the Nature Center because they did a lot of their field work and studies. He took his class out to the Nature Center all the time. And it just shows kind of something that's unique about the Fort Worth Prairie is stair-step topography. And I'll have a picture of that in a minute, but what it is, and he and just a couple other people are like really the only people that documented this. So it's really not, there's not a lot of research literature on this because it's so localized, right? You don't have that many people in this area that care about it or care to study it. But the barrens are up on the top in that super shallow soil. A lot of the times it's going to be in that walnut shell formation, just gravelly limestone. And then you drop off into kind of that stair step. So the limestone, it maybe is eroding less quickly as the shell layer or these clay layers. And then within the shell layers that they're creating avenues for groundwater to go laterally and come out at the surface as a seep. So then you get seep muleys in the center, and then kind of at the base of, or what's called the toe slope of the stair step topography is where you get the taller grasses, because you're getting deeper soil, you're getting the runoff and the lime, the calcium content and all the nutrients kind of are washing down the stair step topography, and where these grasses that can grow in deeper soil grow. And so I noted on here, there are hyper seasonal seeps, meaning they're not seeps year round. It's really dependent on like spring rains and sometimes winter rains. And then they dry out in the dry season or in the summer. But these plants that are growing in those seeps are actually really adapted to that extreme those wet, dry conditions. This is a picture, it's hard to really tell, of Barron. And the bottom picture is Tony Burgess and one of our former interns at the Nature Center. And we were just digging grasses and looking at the roots. And actually, Tony Burgess had his students work on a couple of students work on their master's degree. And they actually went to the Nature Center in those prairie barrens, collected plants, did different tests of green roof material. And then that green roof informed the green roof at BRIT, which is the Botanical Research Institute of Texas. And also Tony had pointed out that if you wanted to do gas pad site restoration, which is this limestone gravel pad sites, you could use these barrens of the Fort Worth Prairie as your example of what plants grow in that. This is a picture from the Nature Center on Oakmont Trail, and it's showing, it's hard to read, but it's showing the bands of the top where the yucca and the gay feather are. That's the prairie barren. Then you kind of drop off into a seep, which is maybe a foot or two lower, and then it just bands down. So these seeps, again, have really two growing seasons. The cold season in the winter, they will have sedges that are kind of growing and seeding. And then the warm season, you'll have these annual forbs and the seep muley. And Shannon Jones was one of Tony's students at TCU, and she also went through the Master Naturalist class. And so this is just a Google Earth image of an example of stair step topography and the banding of the seeps. And this is out at Lake Benbrook, so that's Army Corps of Engineers land. Some of it, that whole area is getting developed rapidly, so a lot of that, anything that's not Army Corps of Engineers property is going to become houses. But this Google Earth image shows the terracing and the seat benches. Also, what people don't really realize, and I mean, unless you could get onto private land, there's not really good examples of this, of vernal pools. So these ephemeral wetlands that are in the Fort Worth Prairie. And this is, it almost looks like the picture was taken in the hill country. These wetlands are not protected in any way whatsoever, like not under federal regulation, because they're not navigable and they're not, they're just seeps, right? And it's not a full-blown wetland like we traditionally think of. This is what became of that seep. It became a gas station. And this is in Rome, Texas. So the picture that I got of the seep was another of Tony Burgess's students from TCU. She did her master's thesis on these vernal pools and seeps. And that was a picture from her study site, and she said it was like amazing. But then it later, I guess whoever owned it, owned that property, sold it, and there's just no protection for wetlands or places like that. So it's now paved over. Some of the things that you would find in that habitat, especially in these seeps, you would find Eleocharis, and that was only recently identified and noted as its own species here in the area. And then seat muley, I've got some range maps on these. So they're basically, the seat muley is found nowhere else in the world except these few counties in Texas and up into a few counties in Oklahoma. I don't really know what the northern part of Oklahoma, like why the disjunct population. And then the pale yucca is what, if you're driving around in the Fort Worth Prairie, you might see pale yucca everywhere and think, wow, it's abundant. And, you know, but that is an endemic species. You're not finding it anywhere else, nowhere else outside of these counties that are highlighted on this map, unless they were transplanted. So nowhere else are they naturally occurring except for the Fort Worth Prairie within this area. It goes down into the Lampasas Cut Plains, so a little bit as well. And so that occulta, like I said, wasn't even described until the year 2000. Then you have these other species. You can see the range map on them as well. When you find, if you're in the Fort Worth Prairie and you find these plants, then you know you've really like hit the big time. You've hit a really good prairie site because these are your high quality relic remnant species that you would find in the Fort Worth Prairie. And this Astivalis, this is a summer gay feather. Again, it wasn't even in the 1999 edition of the Illustrated Flora of North Central Texas, so it was notated and described after that point. So these are some places to see Fort Worth Prairie, Stella Rowan Prairie. That's one of the places we're going to go on a field trip for the Prairie field trip. Tanny Hills, y'all may be familiar with. Of course, the Fort Worth Nature Center you're familiar with. I figure y'all probably had a chance to see enough through your field trips of the Nature Center, so I wanted to go to some different places. And then Chisholm Trail Park, which is in southwest Fort Worth by the Chisholm Trail Parkway. And then so the other prairie system is across timbers. And so we'll talk about eastern and western cross timbers, but this is a map that I got out of Dr. Richard Francoviglia's book, Cast Iron Forest, which is a really, really good book if anyone's interested in the ecology of the cross timbers. I just went onto Google Earth and I outlined the best I could. This is eastern cross timbers right here. So you see it's a super narrow strip. It's kind of like the Iron Curtain, I think. Of like when you had the settlers coming from the east to the west, they kind of got hung up or they were protected behind the eastern cross timbers. But then once they kind of crossed over into the open prairie and then into the savannas, they felt less protected because there wasn't as much of the settlement expansion out in those areas until later. This is the Fort Worth Prairie. And then this is western cross timbers. And then this right here is what is known as the, I think it's the carbonate cross timbers. And so everything all in here is sand. So it's alpha sols. But then when you get right here, I think Palo Pinto Lake State Park or Palo Pinto Mountain State Park is in the carbonate cross timbers. And that's limestone outcroppings that are not derived from, that geology is not from the Cretaceous, it's actually from the Pennsylvanian, so 300 million years ago. So it's just like an outcropping of super, super, super old limestone that was laid down in another sea event long ago. So the cross timbers, especially the western cross timbers, not really eastern cross timbers, but western cross timbers is a savanna ecosystem. And savannas are at that battle line between forests of the east and the Great Plains. So it's just like a back and forth climatic battle between trees and grasslands. Savannas also are, I think, less than 1%. And you can see right here, this is considered savanna. So like oak savanna, you have live oaks here, you have post oaks through here. Then as you get up into the northern central states. Some of their savannas are actually bur oak savannas, which I find odd because they're upland, and like in Illinois, bur oaks are upland species, but here they're bottomland species. Yeah, so 99% has been lost according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So Eastern Cross Timbers, again, that's like Arlington, East Fort Worth, Denton, parts of Denton, Louisville, or parts of Louisville. That is dominated by post oaks and blackjack oaks. It has a gentle topography, sandy soils that have iron ore bits in it, and the precipitation is 30 to 32 inches a year. So this drawing right here kind of is all of the cross timber. So it's going from Texas all the way up into Oklahoma and Kansas. This is what we call the Eastern Cross Timbers right here. This is Western. Once you get up in here, it's just cross timbers. So the Eastern Cross Timbers, again, served as a landmark, as I mentioned. That was kind of like that curtain between civilized and westward expansion. And in 1772, a Spanish explorer noted in his expedition from the Brazos River heading north, he says, one sees a forest on the right, which would be the Eastern Cross Timbers, which serves as a guide even to the most inexperienced and to give refuge to the dangerous region. So he's saying they follow that up. They're on the Fort Worth Prairie, but they're staying right there along the Eastern Cross Timbers. Or they could be on the other side of the Eastern Cross Timbers following the Blackland Prairie up. But like any numbskull with no navigational skills could follow the Eastern Cross Timbers because it was so distinct. And so if they're going up on the Blackland side, then that's like a wall that's protecting them from the dangerous region of the West, which presumably, I guess, would be protecting from Comanches, because by then Comanches probably had taken some horses from the Spaniards. Oh, and this photo I took at Eisenhower State Park up north of Sherman. And that has a really interesting cross of Eastern and Western species, woodland species that you don't even find over here this far west. This photo was taken somewhere in the area of Cooks Lane, and I think it was I-20, I believe. And it was, when I was a forester for the city, it was a survey site, and it actually got developed, and it was like a really awesome property, but it turned into like a storage unit place or something. Again, so I outlined the Eastern Cross Timbers. You can see that a big chunk of it right here through Fort Worth, Arlington, is just, there's nothing left of it. So anywhere you might see Eastern Cross Timbers is more gonna be up towards Denton until, but that's also getting developed. This was from, I think it's a photo from North Richland Hills area that I pulled off the internet. And this is from Washington Irving, who was on some of these expeditions. And in 1832, he said, "I shall not easily forget the mortal toil and vexations of flesh and spirit that we underwent occasionally in our wanderings through the cross timbers. It was like struggling through cast iron." And so that's probably where the name Cast Iron Forest came from, as well as for the book. I'm just gonna see a couple of chats. Let's see. Okay, so I'm gonna stop and read the chat questions. If Mima mounds and Gilgai are beneficial as microclimates, can or should you recreate them when restoring prairie projects? And I think the answer is no, because there's just, how could you do that if we don't necessarily understand the mechanisms of what creates Mima mounds? You could try to create it. I mean, I don't know, maybe you could. And then Gilgai, that's really a soil hydrology thing as well, of churning of the soil. So I think it would be hard to replicate that. Let's see, looking at the lines on the prairie map, what is the gap between the cross timbers and Fort Worth Prairie? I'd have to go back and look at that. That was probably the Eastern Cross Timbers, the narrow gap. And then so many sad development stories. I agree. That's actually what, you know, Texas has a really good economy and has had compared to other parts of the nation. And we're a very attractive place for people to move. So I think that's part of what fuels that. So here's another map, again, by Dijkster-Hoyst, that's showing the cross timber. So this is just a western cross timber. So the gray to the east would be the western cross timbers main belt, which is 4.1 million acres, or he estimated. And then, or no, that's combined. And then the black color is the fringe of the western cross timbers. And so it's not too wide either. And so here's another quote from Captain Marcy, who basically wrote the Prairie Traveler book. And it was just like a guide for people who were heading west through the prairies. He was kind of telling them what are the things that are you need to look out for. It was like a Four Doors or a Lonely Planet book for travelers back then. And so he said at 6 different points going through the cross timbers, he found it characterized by the peculiarities of the trees were primarily post oak and blackjack, and they stood at such intervals that wagons can pass without difficulty between them in any direction. So between those two descriptions, the one that was vexing and it's like the bane and you can't even get through it, it's like a cast iron trying to pass through, that's really talking about the eastern cross timbers. When you get over into the western cross timbers, the account is that it was wide open. It was savanna. So a savanna spacing, that's 25% canopy coverage. So like in a woodlands, you probably learned in your forest presentation that a woodland, forests are like dense canopy, right? Everything's touching, not much light penetrating. A woodland has a little bit more space. By the time you get to a savanna, there's only 25% canopy coverage. So this is a picture I took in Boyd of the savanna spacing, but not necessarily the understory of grass. And this is a picture from LBJ National Grasslands of just kind of a typical scene of the gentle topography, the sandy soils. The main belt of the cross timbers is still in the Cretaceous geology or the Cretaceous strata, and it would have been that sandy soil. Obviously, it's not a deep a sea environment where you're creating limestone, so maybe the limestone had eroded away, and then this is a sandy beach or shallow bottom area. So the fringe is what you see when you go out to Bridgeport. So as you're traveling west, let's say you're in Arlington, you see the post oaks and you go through the Fort Worth Prairie at I-35, then you keep going west, you're running into like these really nice post oaks in Azle or at the Nature Center. And then as you go to just beyond Bridgeport, the post oaks start getting shorter and gnarlier. And that's called the fringe of the western cross timbers. And you actually move into a different geologic layer. That's when you're going into the Pennsylvanian, which is, 300 million years old. And you're getting more steep topography, you're getting rockier, sandier soils, less precipitation, which is why the post oaks are shrinking. The soil hasn't changed so much as the precipitation has changed. And the topography is what determines the fringe also. So this is just sandstone blocks breaking off at Sid Richardson Scout Ranch. So that's just over at Lake Bridgeport. So one of the things in Western Cross Timbers there are glades. So these are just like little pocket prairies within the wooded areas. And they're showing up when the bedrock's exposed, and most of the plants are they're kind of barren habitat and they're growing in the rocks. So if in some areas, you might run into these pocket prairies, and a glade would just be, kind of a barren area within that. And so Dijksterhuis, again, the soil conservation rangeland ecologist, he said he had interviewed people who had lived there, you know, maybe they were born in the 1800s, because he was interviewing people in the 40s, in the 1940s. So he would have been talking to people who maybe were 80 years old in the 1940s. And they were saying in the fringe, there was no undergrowth and that tall grasses were growing luxuriantly in the woodlands, glades, and savannas. And the reason that there wasn't a bunch of undergrowth is because there were fires, and the fires were just naturally occurring. So that would have kept those openings open. It would have kept the savanna a savanna. Just gonna look at chat again real fast. Yes. Yeah, so LBJ National Grasslands. Let's see. Yep, okay, I'll come back to that. Okay, so well, another thing about Western cross timbers is there are ancient cross timbers, so ancient post oaks. And sometimes those post oaks may not be huge. They may not be, you know, 40-inch DBH. They could be 20-inch DBH, and they could just look like any other tree, like a cedar elm as far as their girth, but they're actually really ancient. And so at the Fort Worth Nature Center, there was a study in 1980 by Dr. Dave Staley, who's with the University of Arkansas, and he's a world-renowned dendrochronologist. And he did tree core samples at the Nature Center on the cross timbers, so on Todd Island. And it's hard to figure out where the exact trees are because he didn't have GPS back then, so it's just hand-drawn maps. Now, when I was at the Nature Center, greenhouse volunteers and we went out and we took those hand-drawn maps and took DBH tapes, and we were able to find maybe 5 or more of the, like, verify that those trees were the trees. So then I took some of that data and compared it to see how much the trees had grown. And they don't grow very quickly. So the oldest core from David Staley's core dated back to 1736. And he was able to read fire, drought, insect problems, abundant rain during the growing season. And the tree core that was dated to 1736, on his notes, he said we couldn't count any further back because there was like damage to the center of the core. So it could be older than that. And so if you think about that, that's like way before the Declaration of Independence. So that tree has seen so much more than any of our history. This is a picture of greenhouse volunteers and I going out and measuring the trees that he, or trying to identify those trees that he cored. And this other picture is me just fairly recently, a tree, which was the City of Decatur tree, toppled. And I was able to convince the City of Decatur staff to cut a tree cookie out so I could count the rings. And then I cleaned up the tree cookie and put these pins in it and took it back to the City of Decatur so they could share with the citizenry of Decatur. Basically, I counted, I think it was like 254 years old. And I actually had a retired City of Fort Worth forester, Melinda Adams, come out and count to verify that I was counting right. And so I took that data and compared it with the tree core data from the Nature Center. And I basically came up with, my arm span from fingertip to fingertip, if I hug a tree, is 5 feet. So I can go up to any tree, hug it, and know, okay, my arm span is 5 feet. Well, for post oaks, I figured out with all that data that a tree could probably grow anywhere from 7 to 1 inch DBH every 7 to 14 years, depending on conditions. So that's super slow. And that tree that I did the tree core, it was 36 inch DBH, and it was like 254 years old, as far as I could count into the core. So these are some of the plants that you would see that would be kind of indicators of sandy soil and the cross timbers. So gay feather, shiny goldenrod, Thymbrostylus is in the sedge family with that group. And then bee balm, spotted bee balm is a classic sandy soil cross timbers bee balm, whereas horse mint or what's another name for it? Horse mint's a good name, the one that's purple. I always see that more on calcareous soils. Butterfly milkweed, again, definitely a sandy soil plant. Glen Rose yucca, which we're gonna see on our field trip in a couple of weeks. Glen Rose yucca is found again only in only a couple of locations in Texas, so it's definitely an endemic, and it's growing in super sandy sugar sand soils. And green milkweed is just a classic milkweed that likes sandy soils. Glen Rose yucca again is classified as a globally critically imperiled species. So here are some other plants you would find in the cross timbers: buffalo grass, hairy grama, purple top. Purple top is definitely an indicator species for cross timbers. And I have this picture that actually was emailed to me long before we just had social media things. And I just kept this picture because I thought it was hilarious and horrifying all at the same time. This is poison ivy, and these people took like a family portrait with their poor little baby holding poison ivy. And I imagine that baby probably had a horrific allergic reaction from it. But poison ivy is something you find in the cross timbers in abundance. And these are some places where you can see cross timbers, western cross timbers and eastern. Let's see, someone said, talk about LBJ National Grasslands. I could go on and on and on and on. I used to work there long ago, so I know quite a lot about it, and I've been involved in prescribed burns there and deer surveys. It's not all contiguous. There's a lot of private land interspersed in between. It was basically as a result of the Dust Bowl, even though the Dust Bowl wasn't as affected on the soils here, but people were still farming here. The soils cannot handle more than about 30 years of cotton farming, so it started eroding, and people walked away from their land, and the government got it. So like the Soil Conservation Service, I think, was the first to have the land that was walked away from. And then it eventually became Caddo LBJ National Grasslands. So prairie management, I just kind of cut out some slides of this, and I'll just kind of breeze through it. But humans have used fire to manage prairie for a long time. This is a Friedrich Remington painting called The Grass Fire, and he traveled with surveyors and traveled all across the West and interacted with Native Americans. And so this is, I think, basically not just an artist's rendering. It has some historic value to it. If we were in class in person, we'd have a discussion about what do you think about fire, but we can do that in chat, I guess. More recently, I went to a presentation from a fire ecologist, and she used this map, which is pretty recent map of historic fire intervals from 1650 to 1850. And basically that deep red, right? That's basically saying that less than every 2 years, they believe that all this part of Texas where we're in, which is Blackland Prairie, Fort Worth Prairie, Western Cross Timbers, and some Eastern, that it was affected by fire, naturally occurring fire, upwards of just every 2 years. So that kind of turns, because usually you say, okay, a grassland, a prairie in the US may burn every, say, 3 to 5 years naturally occurring in any one place. That's not saying all of it will burn. But this map is pretty interesting because I wouldn't think, I would have put the savannas at maybe up to 20 years, like anywhere from 5 to 20 years burn interval. But you can see in some of these areas that are purple and blue, they're just not getting fire. And also look at Florida. That's a heavily fire dependent ecosystem. And some of the forests of the Southeast, and then of course following all the way up in the Great Plains. Some of this is controlled by seasons. So like as you get further up here, it's expanding the fire interval because you have shorter seasons where things could catch on fire. So some of the benefits of fire for prairies is to reduce the fuel load so you don't have a catastrophic wildfire later, reduce thatch, return the nutrients back to the soil, stimulate new growth, equalize competition for resources because it clears the slate for everything. Obviously, perennials probably have a better chance of responding to fire, remove or reduce woody species, create a mosaic for increased diversity because typically, especially over a larger area, a fire is not going to burn everything because the fuel may have different soil moisture levels or pockets where the wind doesn't affect it. And so you'll have a mosaic. This is a really bad picture that I pulled off the internet of some fires. I think that was in Oklahoma, but basically, this is just kind of a filler picture to talk about fire seasonality, intensity, and frequency. It's determined by species composition. So if you think of out by Palo Pinto Lake or in Possum Kingdom Lake, there were a lot of ash juniper out there. And in 2011, that place burned a lot. You know, there was a lot of a devastating wildfire in that area. And it was because of seasonality. We're in the middle of a drought. It was in summer. The intensity was because we didn't manage for grasses. We allowed the cedar to take over, the juniper, and frequency hadn't had a burn there. So eventually that all builds up. You have a catastrophic wildfire. And junipers are very combustible. So this is just kind of how to do a box burn. It's just like a simple burning technique. So some of the things you would think about if you were burning and you're doing it for prairie management, you're gonna wanna look at fuel moisture, the relative humidity, the temperature on the day of the fire, what is the topography, what are your purposes and goals of burning? What's the wind speed and direction? Do you have equipment and personnel? You got to look out for safety. And what is the potential fire behavior and the fuel load? So I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on this. That like prairie management is a whole other presentation that you could give, but these are all things that you would consider, and prairies need to be burned. They are fire dependent systems. So they really, in order to be healthy, they need to be burned. And are there burn bans in effect? You can also use grazing, rotational grazing as a management tool. So this is just an example. It's not a very good example, but this is like one place at the nature center where bison don't graze. And this is the bison pasture, east pasture. It's beat down, it's overgrazed, but that's okay because the nature center is using the east pasture as a display so you can have the bison available for viewing from the road. So it's not really so much trying to manage that system or that prairie system. But if you had more land, you could employ rotational grazing and flash grazing. And again, all of these things, you could use cattle the same way bison would have affected a prairie way back when, which we went over earlier. You can also mow. So if you can't burn, you can mow. You could also hay, and that could be part of the management. So one of the tools in the toolbox. And this is at the Nature Center, we hay some of the native prairies and then feed that hay to the bison, and then also sell some of the hay to anyone, you know, not large scale, but, you know, a homeowner who wants to place hay to hold their soil in place or as a seed source can buy hay, a bale or two from the Nature Center. So something else that you would use in prairie management is cut an herbicide of woody species. So that's just a picture of the intern at the nature center, training him on a chainsaw. He probably never used a chainsaw after after his internship. And then this is just how you apply the herbicide on the cambium layer. So it's very controlled herbicide application. And this photo is from Tanny Hill's Brush Bash. So it's pretty labor intensive to control woody species in that method, or using a skid steer with a tree puller or tree cutter. Using a weed wrench is like the worst manual labor I can imagine. So I don't do that anymore. Or in some areas, and they're doing this at LBJ National Grasslands and Caddo National Grasslands, taking forestry mulchers. And so it's just like a rotating drum, and it just turns trees and shrubs into wood chips, and then you can go and burn it. So it sounds radical, and some people who don't understand prairie ecosystems would be freaked out about removing trees in this way, but the whole world is not all trees and cannot be all trees. So for managing prairies, if you can't use fire all the time, you can use these mulchers. And so this is the difference, taking out eastern red cedar. This is on LBJ National Grasslands. After they did some right there mulching, but then these trees they hadn't gotten to, so I popped over there and took a look. And then after they were done, there are no cedars right there. Let's see. Also for prairie management, you could collect seed or purchase seed, locally sourced native seed. You could use a seed drill or hand broadcast, or a no-till seed drill. But what I always recommend is for prairie management or restoration, instead of going out and buying seed, if you have property, or even if in your yard you wanted to set aside just a little area, I would just say, leave it alone, see what comes up, learn what those plants are, because you may have all the components you need without wasting time and money on seed. I learned the hard way. And I could have just not done anything, and I would have saved my back and my money. So that's just really what this photo is about, or this slide is about, just documenting what you have. And so this is part of that fire effects monitoring that I started at the Nature Center. And you can use iNaturalist. That's a super easy tool to use. Y'all probably all know about it already. So there's some threats to prairies, and I think it's the same threats that are threats for anything, woodlands, it's really a lot for prairies. So fences are a huge threat because birds perch on them, deposit seeds through pooping, and then as people, we don't maintain the fence lines and keep it clear of woody species, so that just serves as a node for brushing in an area. Also, just this is taken in Oklahoma, just up I-35, where what was a prairie is obviously it was a prairie, but it's just being completely taken over by eastern red cedar. And that is because of lack of fire. Non-native invasives such as privet, Johnson grass, and feral hogs affect prairies. And then as we talked about, or I talked about earlier, catastrophic wildfires, which are the result of suppression of fire on a landscape, especially a prairie landscape. And what suppression of fire equals is lower species diversity, a monoculture, and a greater likelihood of a catastrophic wildfire. And of course, agriculture, that removes diversity. I mean, we all have to eat, but it also does destroy prairies. And erosion, which is usually a result of agriculture. And then overgrazing. This is a picture that the Texas Parks and Wildlife entomologist took these pictures, and he was just noting, like, on one side of the fence, you have all this great diversity of wildflowers for pollinators, but on the other side of the fence, it was grazed. So there's pros and cons to both. And then the goat one, I just thought it was hilarious because our right-of-ways along highways usually that's where you can find remnant prairies. That's where you find some really great native wildflowers. But these goats have eaten everything. And you know, goats are browsers, they're not grazers. So goats eat woody species. They've eaten everything, including the grass in this picture, which tells me I can't even believe the goats are alive, because goats are, they're not grazers, they're browsers. And then threats, I mean, edge species or edge areas are, they're good in some ways, and then they're bad in some ways. So that's one of those value judgment things that y'all probably talked about on the first Master Naturalist presentation. But edge is actually really, really horrible for specialist species like meadowlarks and dick thistles and savanna sparrows, and you know, certain species that really are like prairie species. And then of course, disease is a threat. This is some trees that I found in Decatur that were post oaks that were dying back. And I asked a couple of foresters and AgriLife, and basically we thought that it was a result of the 2015 floods of getting really saturated soil, and then followed by some kind of droughty conditions. And I thought the trees were in decline and dying, but then they, this was last fall, and they came back. So I think they were just trying to go dormant under stress, but that's not really typical response of post oaks. So something else must be going on. So another threat would just be energy production, and that's kind of everything from wind turbines, all the fragmentation that comes with that, gas pad sites, pipelines. And so this is just a picture of a wind farm that's gone in over by Jacksboro. And so you can see, I mean, it's a prairie ecosystem, and it's getting fragmented by all those roads. But I don't know, I guess it's better than urban sprawl, I suppose. But I don't know, the people that own it, we have a friend that lives out there in that area, and he said that the owners, I think, of this property are probably getting $10,000 a year for each wind turbine site. So you can see why a landowner would be excited about wind turbines, whereas maybe if you're the neighbor, you might not like it. And then this is just on the coast, on the coastal prairies down in South Texas, what a wind farm looks like in a wetland, a coastal wetland. Let's see. And then of course, just urban expansion and maintenance regimes. So I work for the Parks Department, and I know all about our mowing regimes, and that's one of the things that I'm working on in my job to try to improve so that other species can persist in our urban environment. And then of course, deficit of knowledge and that education and sense of wonder about a place, which y'all are not subject to because you're taking a Master Naturalist class. So obviously you're cued in on all of this. So how to make a difference, that's the last thing. If you're moved by any of this, you may already do this, you know, you can buy a special license plate from Texas Parks, or not from Texas Parks and Wildlife, but the money of the plate purchase goes towards funding these projects that help native species and their habitats within Texas. The Native Prairies Association has a Prairie Seekers program, and that is so that we can go out and identify some prairies that could be saved and conserved, and that might also help with the City of Fort Worth's open space program, which is developing since December. And you can put that data on iNaturalist. You can support regional sustainable land use planning and open space part. So if you're in the City of Fort Worth, the City of Fort Worth now has an open space program, which is actively looking at sites within Fort Worth to protect, and prairies are included in that list of matrix criteria. This is the land that's just north of the Nature Center. It's overlooking the West Fork of the Trinity River, and under the Lake Worth Vision Plan, it has all of that land as potential future sustainable neighborhood development, but open space is also talking about, well, what about having that as open space? So land that is protected for various reasons. And I conclude that, you know, everyone really likes trees, right? And trees are big and they're interface, and we want to protect them. And we have a history of worrying about the tropical rainforest and the forest, you know, clear cutting and forests. But we would never frame and hang a picture of a clear cut forest in our living room. So I think about that as like a prairie that is turned into a monoculture. You know, like if I'm looking at a farmland that has wheat or corn, if I didn't know anything about prairies, I might say like, oh my God, that's so beautiful. Well, it has some beauty, but it's also a monoculture, and it is the equivalent of a clear-cut forest or a monoculture forest. But I think prairies are just so underappreciated that we never think about that. Like generally, people don't think about that, but they can recognize value in trees, whereas they do not recognize the value of a prairie. And so going back to Dr. Tony Burgess, because he's a huge mentor, and I toil with these things because I'm so obsessed. I think what I say is like, the more you know, the more it hurts when you see what gets destroyed. Whereas say when I was a 20-year-old, I didn't know the difference and I just thought everything was beautiful and amazing. But as I'm getting older, I'm getting cynical. And so I just always think of what Tony said. And he said he advocates the preservation of native biodiversity. So to some people, this advocacy seems eccentric. And he admits that if you care about the natural world, you can feel hurt by what people do to it. So he tries to channel his concern into projects that help people reconnect with the living landscapes that surround them. So he wasn't saying it had to be prairies or forests or wetlands. He's just saying, help connect people to the environment in which they live so that they have a greater appreciation of the biodiversity that lives around them. And so I think each and every one of us can do that, you know, for not just ourselves and future generations, but for all species that we're sharing this world with. And so with that, here are some recommended reading, some of my favorite books that talk about prairie. And that is my presentation, 2 hours. So I'm going to look in the chat real fast and see if there's, okay, we'll go, let's see. So let's see, somebody was saying, okay, we talked about LBJ. Somebody lives in Westworth Village. There's a lot of development there, especially on White Settlement Road. Yes. There's a big shopping center. Let's see, between Burton Hill and Roberts. But yeah, I don't even think we need another shopping center, seeing how we're all like COVID bound now. I think it's just changing even the way that we exist in society, because we've all discovered Zoom and online shopping, which is sad. Yeah, there would be no way for kids to describe their habitat because there are too many distractions. Yep. Flash grazing is where you turn cattle out into an area quickly. So it could be for a day or for a week. So they're just hitting it kind of, it's mimicking the bison migration instead of having cattle, you know, in one place all the time, grazing, always hitting the same plants. Flash grazing just kind of puts them in there. They eat whatever they can. You get them out real quick. So that gives the plants time to recover. Ash junipers invade prairies for sure. Ash junipers are on limestone soil, and they're that's what you see in the hill country. Also eastern red cedar invade prairies. Everything's relative. Eastern red cedar is mostly, excuse me, growing on sandy soils and wetter soils, but both of them equally can invade prairies. That's because of the absence of fire. Otherwise, fire would control them because if you remove all the green from ash juniper or eastern red cedar, it kills them. So if you cut either of those off at the base, like at ground level, they will not resprout. Could the river trail be turned into prairie? Is that, I'm not sure about that question, if you're talking about the Trinity trails.
Yeah, I was talking about the, you know, all the trails, Trinity trails that we have around town. They're all shaved off right now, but they would make great prairie, wouldn't they? Or at least parts of them possibly. What's the thinking on that?
Yeah, so I know, like even if you look on Google Earth and look at the soil profile of NRCS soil profile, what is upland from the river is Fort Worth prairie soils. So it's calcareous limestone-based soils. That is classic prairie soil for this area. I know TRWD, who manages, I think they do most of the maintenance along the Trinity trails. They have planted wildflower seeds, and they have also, I think, reduced mowing in some areas. If you quit mowing, let's say you didn't mow but once a year, you're going to have a lot of invasives in there, but I guarantee you're going to have a couple of awesome prairie plants in there because they just are able to persist under that mowing, some of them. And so it would be like if you're interested and you go out there and you do iNaturalist, do try to identify some plants on there and pop it up on iNaturalist, because I bet you'd be surprised to see what's actually able to survive like constant mowing. Let's see. Flash grazing with sheep. I don't know, you know, sheep, I talked to the people at Leo Ranch, Dixon Water Foundation, and they use sheep mixed in with cattle. And they have actually a really nice prairie up in Wise County. And they're using sheep, but what sheep do is they're eating all the things cows don't eat. So cows really focus more on grass. And then at different times of the year, they're eating different perennial, like wildflower plants. But sheep are eating a lot less grass, I think, and they're eating more of the forbs. So I think you could do flash grazing with sheep. I think you just want to know what they're eating and how long they're staying.
It was that, or just whatever the sheep would do for the prairie, or do I need to get a cow to graze with my sheep?
So I mean, I think before you get a cow, I would really identify what all you have, and then I would follow the sheep around and see what are they eating, because I don't know anything about sheep. I have never had one. But just talking to the Dixon Water Foundation, they were just saying the sheep are eating what the cattle don't eat generally, so they can kind of be together. But to me, that then you're just hammering everything. So I would kind of follow the sheep around and see what they're eating and what they're eating at what time. And for a good inspiration for that, read Dykstra Hoyce's paper on I think it was the Western Cross Timbers, where he followed cattle around for a year, he and his colleague, and they wrote down what the cattle were eating, what time of year they were eating it. And so we have cattle, and I started following the cows around and making notes. And yeah, they're not just eating grass. So
Thank you. Just as of right now, or up till now, we've just been cutting it as hay, and this is the first year with the sheep. They won't be cut out on the field until next year, but the horses and the goats and the sheep have all been eating what I've been cutting for them.
Yeah, I would definitely just look at, you know, before you cut, go look and kind of use iNaturalist or whatever to see what all you have. Like, you probably in your mind, you know what you have, but like document it so that you can kind of start tracking it, because horses also are eating some different things than cattle, and they're eating in a different way. Like cattle eat a little bit from the top, move around, come back, eat a little bit more. eat a little bit more. Horses just go straight down and grab and yank. And then I don't, goats browse. And woody species and sheep, I guess, are like an in-between. So really they're just all going to be eating different things, and some of it will overlap. And so it would be good to know what you have and then see what is affected.
Okay, I've been putting on iNaturalist since within the last month. So throughout the year and the next few months, as things come up, I will continue to keep monitoring and adding it in. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. iNaturalist is such a great tool. Yep, Trinity Trails. You're welcome. Yeah. Yeah, I would encourage everyone to definitely use iNaturalist. And then someone said, the Native Prairies Association, yes, I registered and paid for that sign as a board member, and registered that prairie on Winscott Road. That's actually Army Corps of Engineers property, and they wanted it to be registered as native prairie. So then the Parks Department installed the sign. So any other questions or comments? I know I've been talking a lot, and I would actually let y'all talk a lot more if we were in person.
Oh, I had a question. I was the one who asked about your backyard. What were you saying? Could you elaborate a bit on what did you say? Not with your yard, because City of Fort Worth tells people to plant the buffalo grass or zoysia.
Mm-hmm.
Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, I think so. Zoysia.
Yeah. So I was just curious what your experience was.
Well, so I actually, even though I ran a greenhouse, I don't have a green thumb, and that's why I love native plants. I will kill an ivy. I will kill, anything that's ornamental or horticulture variety. So my yard is actually, part of it is buffalo grass that's just naturally occurring, and then part of it is Bermuda grass that somebody planted whenever. And so, yeah, I don't water my yard. In fact, when it gets droughty, I get excited when the grass dies back, because then I don't have to mow it. But basically a big chunk of my yard is taken over by native landscaping. So I just have flower beds everywhere. And then I like perennials that have hardy roots, that are rhizomatous. And I just plug them around the yard, and then I just keep moving stuff, and I give stuff to people, and people give me stuff. And so my yard basically blooms from February till November.
Oh, did you plant the grass though? I know
I didn't plant it. No, I actually tried. This is so not me, but in my dog's backyard, I actually went and bought St. Augustine sod, and then I killed it. I couldn't keep it alive. So yeah, I'm not gonna be not gonna have good information on getting lawn established or buffalo grass sod established.
Well, I know it's just half my grass is dead anyway, and yeah, it sounds like maybe something similar happened, and you just said you just didn't do anything.
No, but see, I don't have neighbors. I don't know if you have, if you live in a neighborhood where people would get angry if you, let all your grass die. So,
well, it's in my backyard, so nobody sees it. Does it help with the shift? I mean, does it help with the soil shifting too, your native stuff?
Yeah. It builds up soil like nobody's business. Yeah, you could put wood chips, or if you're having an area in your backyard that's just not getting established, then I would try a little pollinator garden, or you could cover it with wood chips.
Okay.
Or you could do decomposed granite. You can make a rock garden. You could make a succulent garden. If it's super shady, you could plant Canada wild rye and inland sea oats and Cherokee sedge and some things that like deeper shade, and just kind of line that area out and put a border around it so that you don't have to try to maintain a lawn in that area.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. And I'll just go to my last slide. That's my last official slide. And that picture was taken by Chris Emery, who's a local professional photographer, and he took that out at Fort Worth Prairie Park, which is like the Prince of Parks. I call it the formerly known as Fort Worth Prairie Park because it was never a park, and it actually got developed, so most of it. Oh, okay. I think you're welcome. And I think Melinda can answer what to read for next week's class. And then I was just going to tell you all for the Prairie field trip, I'm still figuring it out what we're going to do. And so I'm just going to send an email to the class with information, but we are going to have to wear masks. I'm going to split us up into groups, smaller groups, so that we can comply with the 10 and under order from the governor, and I'll just have interactive stuff. So we've kind of seen each other's faces. Maybe we don't see so much of our faces on the field trip, but I'll send out the information here before the field trip. And Melinda.
All right. Thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate that. It was wonderful. Let's all give Michelle a little silent round of
Yeah.
We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was great.
Thank
I've
you. That was great.
heard that lecture a few times now, and it's always just as interesting every year because I forget things. So it's great. Thank you so much. As for the chapter for next week, I think it's invertebrates next week, and I am looking for my textbook, and I thought it was sitting right here next to me, but I don't see it. I would just look for chapters on invertebrates. I will get with, Brent is going to be doing part of our lecture, I believe. Is that correct, Brent? If you're still there.
Am I? I don't know. Maybe.
You're not. Well, so do you have a?
I guess I better put something together real quick.
Better throw something together in a hurry. No, but it'll be invertebrates, so insects and again, I don't have my book right here, and I thought it was right here. It's gone. I think maybe Zane might have grabbed it. But we'll get something off to you guys about a chapter to read. And does anybody have anything for me before we go?
Melinda, the schedule I have shows the invertebrates is going to be at the Hardwick Center. Is that right?
Oh no, that well, that'd be great if we could do that. But no, everything's virtual. If it said that, it's just old information. So no, we're not going to be. We'll be doing it here at just here on Zoom again next week. Same
All right. Thank you.
channel. So, all right. Anybody else? Anything before we go?
Going once.
All right. Well, thank you. One more quick thank you to Michelle. We really appreciate everything, and we'll see everybody next week.
Clap, 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 clap. Yay.
Hey, ciao. Arrivederci.
All right. Bye.